The stars had not changed. That was the first thing Sergeant Marin Voss noticed when the Varric ship's lights went dark across the Oslo sky. The stars behind it were the same as they had always been. Indifferent and cold and impossibly far. And for one fraction of a second, she felt something very close to calm. Then the alarm started. She was 41 years old. She had been a combat choreographer for the Norwegian Defense Xenobiology Unit for 11 years, which meant she designed how human bodies moved through alien contact zones, how soldiers positioned themselves, how medics rotated through a hot grid, how civilians were herded without panic through corridors that smelled of ozone and burned plastic. She was not a fighter in the way that word had come to mean anything. She planned how other people fought. She was very good at it. She had come home from the Reykjavik Coordination Summit 3 days before Christmas, and the apartment was full. Her partner Eric's 3 children from his first marriage, Ingrid, who was 17 and furious about everything, Henrik, 15, and gone half feral with boredom, and little Pia, 9, who still climbed into Marin's arms without asking permission. Their 2 together, Jonas, 12, who already had his father's habit of talking around hard things, and Maja, 6, who did not yet know how to be anything but herself. Marin's father was visiting from Tromsø, walking carefully on his artificial hip, watching everything with the patience of a man who had already said his prayers for the year. Eric's colleague Bart had come up from Brussels with his daughter Elise, 11 years old and wide-eyed, because it was easier than explaining to her why Christmases were complicated now. The apartment held them all, barely. There were coats on every hook and shoes in configurations that made no geometric sense, and the smell of cardamom and reheated coffee and whatever Pia had spilled on the rug in the hall. Marin stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and looked at all of it, and felt the particular vertigo of a person who has been alone and purposeful for too long suddenly returned to something that requires a different kind of attention entirely. She had been getting headaches for 6 weeks. She had not told anyone. The diagnosis came on the 23rd of December. An MRI, a referral, a room with no windows where a doctor whose name she kept almost catching spoke carefully about lesions and progression and the particular cruelty of secondary spread. The tumor was in the right temporal lobe. It had almost certainly started in her lungs. She had survived a small resection 18 months ago. Clean margins, they said. Recovered, they said. Back to work by September, she said. She sat in that room, and the doctor kept talking, and Marin watched his mouth and tried to keep up. But there was a kind of static in her skull, the kind that comes when a frequency overwhelms the receiver, and she was nodding. She realized she was nodding along, as though this were a briefing she had prepared for and understood. She was not afraid. That would come later. What she felt in that moment was something more like embarrassment, for her hot body, which had made this decision without consulting her, for the tumor, which had the particular bad manners of arriving at Christmas. She drove home. She sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes. Then she went upstairs and put on water for tea and did not tell Eric until the children were in bed. He didn't cry. He was a big man, Eric Holst, theater director, a man who had spent 30 years making other people's catastrophes legible to audiences. And when she told him, he went very still in the way that large men go still when something has struck them below, where they had thought they were armored. His hands were on the table. He looked at them. "Okay," he said. "It may not be operable," she said. "They need more imaging, more consultations. But they were very clear that it's the same tumor, the same." "Okay," he said again. He wasn't agreeing. He was trying the word out, seeing if it would hold. She watched him and felt something she hadn't expected. Impatience. She needed him to ask her something. To say something that was actually about her, not about his processing. But he just sat there with his hands flat on the table, and the water boiled, and she got up and made the tea herself. That was the shape of things. That had always been the shape of things, if she was being honest, though she had not been honest about it for years. Eric was a wonderful man who was very good at work, and who had, over a decade together, slowly made her into one more production he was confident was running smoothly. She had let him. That was also true. She had been so busy being capable that she had not left him room to learn her. And now she had this tumor in her head and 10 days of Christmas, and somewhere between those two facts, she was going to have to figure out who they actually were to each other. The Varek did not arrive for 3 more days. Later, she would understand that the timing was not coincidence. The Varek were mathematicians in the way that rivers are mathematicians. not by intention, but by the logic of how they moved, always finding the lowest resistance, always flowing toward what could be exploited. They had been watching Earth for 4 years from a transit position behind Jupiter's shadow, and they had timed their arrival with great care, arriving on the 26th of December because their models suggested that a species' festive period would correlate with psychological vulnerability, depleted military readiness, and a kind of collective intoxication on myth and sentiment that might be weaponized in the opening hours. They were not wrong about any of this. They were wrong about what it meant. Marin was in the kitchen at 5:40 in the morning, unable to sleep, eating leftover risotto cold from the pot, when the emergency channel on her tablet screamed awake. She had the notification suppressed to silent, but it was hardwired to override suppression for a level 1 contact event. The vibration was so violent the tablet walked itself across the counter. She looked at the message. She put down her fork. She went to the window. The Varric ship was not what she had expected, though she had read every theoretical paper on first contact vessel design since she was 26. It was not sleek. It had no dramatic geometry. It was enormous, 7 kilometers from bow to whatever served the Varric as a stern, and it was covered in protrusions and asymmetric structures that reminded her absurdly of a coral reef or the underside of a barnacled hull, things that grew by accretion and necessity rather than plan. It moved over Oslo at a speed that violated the emotional logic of something so large. Too slowly, wrong, the way a moon would move if moons wandered, and the lights it cast were not light exactly, more like an interruption of light. A reminder that light required permission. Her tablet was giving her a location. Command was already assembling at the Acre Brig coordination hub. She was already dressed. Eric was in the bedroom doorway. He had heard the tablet. He had his arms crossed over his chest in the particular way he had when he was afraid and trying to appear like a man who was not afraid. "I have to go," Marin said. "Your scans are scheduled for the 29th. She picked up her bag. "That doesn't move." "Marin," she stopped. She looked at him. He was gray at his temples now, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in the photographs from the year they met, and she thought, "We have wasted so much time on the shape of things rather than the things themselves." "I'm coming back," she said. She meant it as reassurance. It came out as something more complicated, a promise or a challenge or a decision she was making in real time. She left. The coordination hub was chaos of the organized variety, controlled chaos, the kind that has protocols underneath it and only looks formless to someone who doesn't know where to look. Marin knew where to look. She moved through it to the central planning room and found Commander Adeyemi bent over a holographic table displaying the Varric ship's current position, its projected trajectory, and 6 concentric rings of threat probability that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. "Voss," Adeyemi said without looking up, "tell me they landed wrong." "They landed exactly where they wanted to," Marin said, pulling up the subsurface display. "Look at the shadow pattern. They're over the highest density of communication infrastructure in Scandinavia. That's not an accident. Weapons deployment? Not yet. They're waiting. For what? For us to do something stupid." She had 3 analysts, 2 holographic stations, and a direct link to the contact protocol team at the UN Coordination Center in Geneva. She had a headache that had been building since she woke, and which she was ignoring with the focused aggression of someone who has decided that the alternative is worse. She had, somewhere behind her ribcage, the thing the doctor had told her, which she was also ignoring, though less successfully. The Varric made first contact at 9:17 in the morning. It was not dramatic. A signal, translated through the contact protocol team's linguistic AI, with a latency of 40 seconds per exchange. The translation was rough. The Varric's communication structure was layered in a way that human language had no clean vocabulary for, somewhere between mathematical proof and threat display. But the substance was clear enough. They were claiming the solar system. Not Earth specifically, the solar system. Earth was an incidental complication. There was a silence in the communications room when this was read out. Then someone laughed, not out of humor, out of the particular absurdity of the moment. A species that had been worrying about its own smallness since it first looked up and saw the stars being told, by something that had crossed those stars, that it was even smaller than it thought. Marin did not laugh. She was looking at the translation and thinking about the specific grammar of the Varric's claim, the way the linguistic AI had rendered it, the particular verb tense, the absence of something she couldn't quite name yet. "Run it again," she said. Her analyst looked at her. The translation. Run it through the secondary matrix. He did. The secondary matrix came back with a different rendering of the claim's main verb. Not claiming, but reminding. The Varek were not announcing a new acquisition. They were informing Earth of an existing arrangement, one they appeared to believe had already been made. They think someone already agreed to this, Marin said. That's insane, said the analyst. Yes, Marin said, but it changes how we talk to them. The first week was negotiation, or what passed for it. The Varek did not escalate. They held position. They jammed certain satellite communication bands and restored others seemingly at random, though Marin's team identified a pattern in the restorations within 30 hours. The Varek were allowing channels they could monitor more easily. They were listening. They wanted to know what humans said to each other when they thought they weren't being heard. Marin worked 20-hour days. She slept on a cot in the planning room and ate whatever her analyst brought her without looking at it. Her head hurt constantly. She had been managing the steroid prescription her neurologist called in. She had managed to get a phone consultation on the 28th, the imaging rescheduled to the 8th of January. And the steroids were making her hungry and sleepless and prone to a kind of electric irritability that she was burning through discipline to contain. She was also, intermittently, terrified. Not of the Varek. The Varek were a problem with edges she could work. The tumor had no edges she could find yet. It sat in her skull and waited with the infinite patience of something that has no concept of hurry. Eric called twice a day. He was managing the children. He was not good at managing the children. He was good at directing them, at giving them roles and blocking an intention, which was not the same thing. Marin could hear it in the background of the calls, the particular frequency of a household that is running on love and improvisation, and she felt guilty and grateful in equal measure and did not know how to say either. The kids keep asking when you're coming home, he said on the third day. Tell them I don't know yet. I know that. What do I tell them? Tell them I'm working on it. She paused. Tell them I'm proud of them. For handling everything. There was a silence. Are you sleeping? Enough. Marin, not really, no. Another silence. Eric had a habit when he didn't know what to say, of saying nothing rather than filling space with something inadequate. She had once loved this about him. Now she wanted him to say something inadequate. She wanted to hear him struggle toward her out loud. I looked up the tumor, he said finally. The type. The treatment protocols. Eric? I needed to understand it. I couldn't. I was sitting here not understanding it, and I needed to. She closed her eyes. And? The surgical outcomes for resectable cases are, they're not as bad as I thought. His voice was careful, precise. He was a man building something with words, testing each beam before he put his weight on it. If it's resectable. If. Yes, if. She let that sit between them. Outside the planning room window, the Varek ship was visible against the sky, enormous and still, and covered in its strange accretions. 7 kilometers of something that had crossed light years to be here, for reasons that remained, despite her best analysis, not entirely clear. I'm going to come home, she said. When there's a shape to it, I'm going to come home and we're going to talk. Not about the tumor, about us. She heard him breathe. Okay, I mean actually talk. Not the way we've been talking. I know what you mean. Do you? A pause, then quietly, yes, I do. The breakthrough came on the 6th day. And it came from the last place anyone expected, which was from Maren's daughter Maja, age 6, who had gotten hold of her mother's unattended tablet and sent a voice message to the Varek communication channel because she had seen her mother do it and wanted to try. What Maja said in the message was, "Hello, this is Maja. My mama is busy. She will come home when she is finished. Please be patient. We are having Christmas." The message was not by any measure a diplomatic communication. The UN contact team's first response was to treat it as a catastrophic breach. A child's voice, unvetted, on the primary channel, saying things that had no bearing on any of the 700 pages of carefully constructed contact protocol. The Varek responded in 40 seconds, the fastest they had ever responded to anything. Their response, translated, was a question, "What is Christmas?" Marin read it and sat back in her chair and felt something shift in her chest that was not the tumor. It was something older and stranger. The feeling of a door opening in a wall you had believed was solid. She drafted the response herself. She worked on it for 4 hours with the linguistic AI and 3 analysts and a sinosociologist she pulled in from a university in Bergen who had been waiting by her phone for 6 days, hoping someone would call. What they produced was not a definition. Definitions were the wrong shape for this, but a description. Christmas, they told the Varric, was a period of deliberate gathering, of eating together, of children receiving things, of the old being visited, of the cold outside and the warm inside, of telling stories about hope in the dark. The Varric were silent for 9 hours. When they responded, their language had changed. The mathematical proof structure had softened into something the AI rendered with less confidence, more ambiguity, which the xenosociologist said, with barely contained excitement, was itself significant, because it suggested the Varric's communication structure had registers for uncertainty, for things that were felt rather than known. What they said, as best as the AI could render it, was, "We did not know you gathered. Our models said you were singular." Marin read this and understood something that had been assembling in the back of her mind for 6 days. The Varric had spent 4 years observing Earth. They had watched military communications, infrastructure, economic flows, the movement of satellites and ships and aircraft. They had built an extraordinarily detailed model of human behavior, and they had built it from the top down, from systems and structures and patterns. What they had not modeled, because it did not appear in satellite imagery or communication intercepts, was the apartment full of coats, the children's shoes in impossible configurations, the smell of cardamom, the 6-year-old who sent a voice message because she missed her mother. They had modeled humans as individuals who cooperated. They had not understood humans as creatures who gathered, who needed to gather, who would fight to gather. This was the error. This was the door. Marin spent the next 30 hours building a response protocol unlike anything in the 700 pages. She didn't sleep. Her head was a sustained low roar that she had learned to work beneath rather than through. She ate cold food and drank too much coffee, and at one point stood in the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for 30 seconds, which was the amount of time she could afford, and thought, "You look terrible, and also, you are still here." The protocol was not a negotiation strategy. It was an invitation. She structured it around the Varric's apparent confusion about the concept of gathering, not to exploit that confusion, but to address it directly. She proposed a contact window, not satellite communication. Physical proximity, a human delegation, no weapons, meeting a Varric delegation on neutral ground, where both sides could be seen. The UN contact team pushed back hard. Command pushed back harder. Someone in Geneva used the word unhinged, which she took as a point in favor of the idea. She sent it anyway. She had the authority, technically under the emergency protocols, which granted the lead xenobiology coordinator discretion to expand contact methodology in novel first contact scenarios. She had written half of those protocols herself 5 years ago. She had included that clause on purpose, though she hadn't known then what she was making room for. The Varric accepted within an hour. The meeting was in the Acre Brig waterfront square, under the open sky, at dawn on the 1st of January. It was below zero. The fjord was dark and still. The Varric came in a shuttle that descended without sound and landed with a precision that made human engineering look like guessing. There were 7 of them. They were tall, 2.5 meters, roughly, and laterally wide in a way that made the eye want to recalculate their silhouettes. They had no faces in any arrangement humans would recognize as a face, but they had something in the forward area of their bodies that oriented toward things they were attending to. And when they disembarked from the shuttle and stepped onto the snow of the waterfront square, that forward area oriented immediately toward Marin. She walked toward them. She had 8 people behind her. She had, in her coat pocket, the photo that Maja had drawn for her, a child's drawing of their apartment, stick figures in a row, labeled in a 6-year-old's handwriting, Mama, Papa, Maja, Jonas, Ingrid, Henrik, Pia. She had put it there without knowing why, and she had not taken it out. It was just weight. It was just something that had traveled with her. She stopped 3 meters from the lead Varric. It was guessing on her part that this was the lead. She had nothing to base it on except that it had come first, and that seemed like it might be universal enough. She did not have a prepared speech. She had decided this deliberately, which her analysts had argued against, and which she had ignored. Prepared speeches were for situations you had anticipated. She said what she thought, in the language of bodies that humans and Varric had been slowly building over 6 days of careful back and forth. She spread her hands, palms up, fingers open. The lead, Varric, was still for 4 seconds. Then it did something with the lateral structures of its body, a slow spreading movement that had no exact human analog but which felt, in the way that some things bypassed translation entirely and arrived directly in the gut, like something being put down. a weight being set aside. Then it spread its own structures, which were not hands, in an answering gesture. The xenosociologist, watching from 30 meters away, made a sound that was not quite a word. What followed was not a negotiation. It was a conversation conducted through the linguistic AI over 4 hours, in which the Varek asked questions and Marin answered them, and Marin asked questions, and the Varek answered them, and slowly, in the way that two people who have been shouting across a distance discover that they are closer than they thought and can lower their voices, the distance between their frameworks for understanding each other began to close. The Varek had not known that humans held their dead, that they returned to places they had been happy, that they marked the passing of time with ceremonies specifically designed to remind themselves that time was passing, that they named children for grandparents, that they decorated the inside of their dwellings in winter specifically because winter was dark and they needed the light to come from inside. The Varek understood territory, hierarchy, resource acquisition, threat and counter-threat. They understood in their own way the mathematics of survival. They had not understood that humans survived toward something, that the gathering was not incidental to the species, but definitional, that you could take everything from a human, ground, resources, safety, and they would still find each other in the dark and make light and call it hope. By the 4th hour, the lead Varek communicated something that took the AI 20 minutes to render with any confidence, that their models had calculated human resistance would last between 40 and 90 days before capitulation, that this calculation had been made without accounting for the variable they were now attempting to name. The variable was something in the range of what the AI kept rendering with evident uncertainty as the weight of being known. They had not understood that humans fought harder for the person beside them than for any abstraction, that the soldier who holds a line holds it because of the specific faces behind them, the specific names, the specific weight in the arms of a sleeping child, that the species that could cross a square in 0-degree weather with its hands open and its heart doing what it was doing and offer not power but presence, that species had never been accurately modeled. They had been looking at the outputs. They had never understood the inputs. The Varek withdrew their claim to the solar system on the 3rd of January, not because they were defeated, because they had updated their model, and the model now said something different. Whether that difference was wisdom or pragmatism or something in between was a question that would occupy scholars for a generation. Marin drove home in the early afternoon of the 3rd of January. She had not slept in 36 hours, and her head was the worst it had been yet. And she had an imaging appointment in 5 days, and she did not know what it would show. She parked in the garage below their building and sat there for a while. Not 11 minutes this time. Longer. She was thinking about what the lead Varek had communicated in the last hour of the contact window through the AI. Haltingly, in a register the AI kept flagging as uncertain. It had asked whether the gathering Maja had described, Christmas, the warm inside, the stories about hope in the dark, whether this was still happening, whether it had continued in her absence. Marin had said yes. She believed it was still happening. The Varek had been quiet for a long time. Then it had asked a question that the AI rendered 3 different ways before settling on the version that seemed most accurate. Does the gathering know that you are coming back? She had not answered. She had not known how. She knew now. She took the elevator up. She could hear the apartment before the door opened, the specific frequency of it, the voices overlapping, Eric's low rumble and Ingrid's sharper register, and the periodic eruption of Pia. She stood at the door with her key in her hand. The door opened before she used it. Maja was standing there in her pajamas, which meant she had refused to get dressed, which meant the day had been approximately what Marin had expected, and her face was the face of someone who had been waiting and was not going to pretend otherwise. "You came back," Maja said. "I told you I would. You were gone a long time. I know." Maja considered this with the seriousness that 6-year-olds bring to facts that require weighing. Then she stepped back to let Marin through. The apartment was the same chaos, the shoes in their impossible configurations, the coats on the hooks, her father at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and the particular patience of a man who had learned that waiting was not the same as passivity. Henrik had apparently built something out of the leftover Christmas wrapping. Ingrid was sitting on the floor with Elise, Eric's colleague's daughter, showing her something on a phone. Jonas was in the kitchen doorway eating a piece of bread and not talking, which was his preferred state. Eric was at the counter. He was making something, or pretending to, and when she came through the door, he turned and he looked at her and he stopped pretending. He was across the kitchen in 3 steps and his arms were around her and he was shaking. She realized, not visibly, not the way he had in the doctor's office when the news first hit him, but a fine internal tremor. The kind a large structure makes when something has been pressing on it for a long time and suddenly releases. She put her face against his shoulder and smelled his particular smell and thought, here, this. This is what the Varric couldn't model. They stood like that for a while, with the apartment going on around them the way apartments do. The children pretending not to notice or actually not noticing, which amounted to the same thing. Then Maja, who had followed Maren through the door and stationed herself nearby, said, "Are you crying, Papa?" "No," Eric said, in the voice of a man who absolutely was. "It's okay if you are," Maja said with great reasonableness. "Mama is home." Maren laughed. It hurt her head, and she didn't care. She felt Eric's arms tighten briefly, and then he pulled back and looked at her face in the way he had not looked at her face in she could not remember how long. Years, maybe. The way you look at something when you have remembered that it is irreplaceable. "We need to talk," she said. "About everything, about us, about what comes next." "I know. I don't mean tonight. Tonight I'm just—" She looked around the kitchen, at her father's coffee cup and Jonas's bread and the impossible shoes in the hall. "Tonight I'm just here." "That's enough," Eric said. It wasn't, of course. There was an imaging appointment in 5 days, and whatever it showed, and whatever came after that. There were the conversations they had been avoiding for years that they were going to have now. Because the tumor had stripped away the excuse of later, had made later a word that required qualification every time you used it. There was the question of whether what they had was what they thought it was, or whether it was the shape of something, and whether the shape was enough. But the apartment was warm. The children were here, or most of them. Her father was at the table. Outside, the sky over Oslo was just the sky again, cold and dark and crowded with the ordinary stars. And the 1st of January is not an ending. It is, specifically, a beginning. A line drawn by humans across the otherwise undifferentiated flow of time, a decision to say, here, this is where we start again. It is a fiction. All calendars are fictions. But there is a species that has crossed the galaxy and arrived at the edge of human consciousness and found, at the center of it, not weapons or systems or the machinery of survival, but this, the stubborn insistence on beginning again, on marking the moment and gathering in the cold and calling it hope. The Varric had updated their model. They would spend years working out what to do with the update. Maren Voss sat down at her kitchen table across from her father and accepted the cup of coffee he was already pouring for her, because he had seen her come through the door and begun pouring before she reached the chair. Because he had been doing this her whole life. Because some knowledge doesn't require words. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The coffee was too hot and she held it anyway. Outside the stars, inside the light.